Welcome, friends. It's good to have you here. My name is Stephen Fetter. I manage the United Learning Program for the General Counsel Office. And it is a pleasure and a delight to gather with you and to have a chance to connect with you from coast to coast to coast. And just as we gather, I'd love it if you could just add your name to the chat. Well, the name will come up anyway, but tell us where you're from and what part of the country you're in, because we weren't really doing that as we gathered, and it's always fun to see that. And as we're doing that, I'm going to introduce my colleagues whose mics I have turned off, so you'll have to turn them on again. But let me bring up Catherine Mclean and John Young. And I'll invite the two of you to open your mics and introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from. So Catherine, you first.
Thanks very much. Well, I'm on the North Saskatchewan River, Treaty 6 in Edmonton. I'm the senior minister at St. Paul's, and I've been here for about 20 years. The landscape of my soul is the East Coast. I grew up in the Maritimes and have served Yellowknife and Canmore, which is in the Rocky Mountains as well. So delighted to be here and to work with my colleague John, and certainly been working with Steve on these, so it feels like we're well acquainted with the systems, and we hope that what we offer will be useful.
Oh, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to do. So, John, who are you and where are you connecting from tonight?
So John Young, I'm speaking to you tonight from downtown Toronto. I'm at Emmanuel College, where I'm currently serving for a year as interim principal. If I were not here, I would be about a 2-hour drive east of here in a community called Moira, which is north of Belleville, Ontario, community of about 85 or 90 people. As is true for Catherine, my roots are also in the Maritimes, although mine are in northeastern New Brunswick. But from there, and that is also very much a part of who I am. I served in congregational ministry in Nova Scotia and then in Ontario. I taught for a while at Queen's Theological College, Queen's University. Was in the General Counsel office for about 5.5 years and had planned to retire. And then Emmanuel asked me to come here for a year. So that's what I'm doing. And good to be with you all.
I have discovered that God has a sense of humor. So friends, we're going to use the chat tonight for you to talk to us. There are about 27 of us on the line now. We could have another 6 or 10 people join us. And that's just too many to open up the mics and deal with a flood of questions. So I'm going to invite you instead to use the chat box and type your questions. I will watch the questions, and at the appropriate stopping points, I'll come back on the screen and come at Catherine and John so that they don't have to read the chat box either. I would say if you're comfortable reading the chat and listening at the same time, by all means do, it's public. But don't feel like you have to. Feel like you're going to miss anything important if you're paying attention to Catherine instead. The really important thing is that you connect with our presenters, and I will do my best to hold up representative comments that come in, questions that come into the chat, and bring those back into the conversation. The chat is not captured in the recording anyway, so even if you're reading it live, the folks on the recording need me to do that as well. And just before we move into the presentation, I invited you to add into the chat where you're from, and that's great, and I appreciate you doing that. It has also become our practice in these United Church events to acknowledge territory. Some of you have also been doing that, and thank you for that. But I wanted to give us all a chance to acknowledge not only the name of the town or the province that we live in as it is known today by people of our ancestry, but to acknowledge the treaty that we're bound by and the peoples who have lived on the land where we're living now for thousands of years before my ancestors arrived in this country. So I would invite you just to think again about where you are and to add these into the names that you are acknowledged. I'm not going to read them aloud. I will let you read them in the chat. There are so many names that I don't know how to pronounce that I think it is more respectful simply to let you read it on your own. With John, I too am acknowledging the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. And a dish with one spoon, wampum belt covenant. It always is moving to me to see all the different names and to realize I don't know how to pronounce them, realize how much more I have to learn. And yet to realize that we live in this vast continent that has nourished peoples for thousands of years. That is awe-inspiring. Catherine and John, you've got a sense of the agenda. I really don't. So I'm going to stay out of the way unless you call on my name, and over to whichever of you is presenting first tonight.
John, you were going to open with prayer. That's.
Yep, and so I shall. So let us pray. O God of love, you created us in love, for love. Love of you, love of neighbor. And to those two expressions of love, we are called. Grant us wisdom in the living of these days to see what loving neighbor means, to see what the loving thing to do is. And then grant us the grace and the strength so to love. These things we pray in the name of the one who has set us free to love. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Steve, if you bring up the first slide, please, or just as a word of introduction. I never expect people to remember things that aren't right in front of us. So here we are, just to let you know what we're about this evening. So welcome. And John and I have developed a methodology of coming at doctrine and have appreciated the response for that, and certainly have enjoyed the work that we've done together on it. And it has been on our minds always, but particularly in this last 21 months, the concern that we have for the deep current of divide that just puts a gaping canyon between us. It's as though it carves a line in the landscape across which we cannot make our way, just this gaping canyon. The divides between and among us. And when we're thinking about divides, we thought it's not always connected, but the concept, the theological concept of forgiveness is important as well. So in these next 2 weeks, we will focus on these two things, divides and forgiveness. And if you take us to the next slide quickly, thanks, Steve. This is the book that we published 6 years ago, Preaching the Big Questions, and it's the methodology from that we're working. When we're looking at preaching, our concern is always about the formation of the Christian life. It's always about ethical living, and it's always about pastoral care. So from those three things, formation, ethical living, and pastoral care, come the energy, the trajectory around which we have engaged issues of doctrine, and in which we will engage these themes as well. Divides obviously is not a doctrine, but it is a theme, it's a concern, it's a current among us. The next slide, thanks, Steve. There is the methodology that we use. We define the theme, the concern. We consider what scripture would be helpful in making our way through it, and then in providing something for the community in terms of preaching. We ask the question, why does it matter? What does this have to do with things? And then we ask, how does it preach? So that's the way that we have been working ahead. And we'll go to the next slide, and then the next one, because this is where we want to begin. I promise you, I'm not giving it away. John and I share a great deal of energy for reading Louise Penny. I've read the book, he hasn't, so I'm not giving anything away, but I want to read you the first couple of paragraphs. This doesn't feel right, Patron. Isabelle Lacoste's voice in his earpiece was anxious, verging on urgent. Chief Inspector Gamache looked out over the roiling crowd as the noise in the auditorium rose to a din. A year ago, a gathering of this sort would not only have been unthinkable, it would have been illegal. They would have broken it up and gotten everyone tested. But thanks to the vaccines, they no longer had to worry about the spread of a deadly virus. They only had to worry about a riot. Armand Gamache would never forget when the Premier of Quebec, a personal friend, had called him with the news that they had a vaccine. The man was in tears, barely able to get the words out. When the pandemic was finally officially declared over, the little village of Three Pines where the Gamaches lived had gathered on the village green. The names of the dead had been read out. To great ceremony, Myrna unlocked her bookstore. Sarah opened the doors to her boulangerie. Monsieur Béliveau put the ouvert sign in the front of his general store, and a cheer rose up as Olivier and Gabri opened their bistro, banks of barbecues, grilled burgers. Friends and neighbors hugged and even kissed. Chief Inspector Gamache looked across the large space in the auditorium to the doors at the far end where the spectators were still streaming in. This should never have been allowed, said Lacoste. He didn't disagree. In his opinion, everything about this was madness, but it was happening. Is everything under control? There was a pause before she replied, yes, but. And the next screen, please, Steve. In the crowd are people wearing buttons. All shall be well, the buttons say. Ça vient bien aller. All will be well. Those words that Louise Penny uses through her book, she has used in other of the Inspector Gamache novels. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Julian of Norwich was an anchorite during the Black Plague, which means that she anchored herself in one place. She was in one place during the plague, and she wrote, during that pandemic, all shall be well. Let's have the next slide, thank you. I have a poster of All Shall Be Well in my study, and I've puzzled over it. I don't usually preach on it because I find it, well, I don't understand it. I really do not. As a faithful person, I see that it might have to do with the eschaton. It might have to do with a deep sense of hope. But C.S. Lewis, writing to a friend, put it better than I ever could. The real difficulty is, isn't it, he writes, to adapt one's steady beliefs about tribulation to this particular tribulation. For the particular, when it arrives, always seems so peculiarly intolerable. Intolerable. We might have thoughts about the Black Plague. We might have thoughts about the polio vaccine. We might have thoughts of other pandemics, but this one is our peculiar opportunity to consider this ourselves, what divides us. So the next slide, thank you, Steve. Divides is both a noun and a verb, and I've chosen the word divides rather than divisions. Divisions is a noun, it is static, it is reified, it is something between you and me, something division, but divides is a noun, but divides is also a verb. And I think that gives us a lot more fluency as we are considering the various things around us that are troublingly dividing us. Divides is both a noun and a verb. And so the next slide, thank you, Steve. I think this is the reason that the divides are such a problem. Jeff Burns has got this paraphrase of very familiar scripture, the golden rule, the two commandments, the things on which everything that Jesus teaches hang. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, treat other people as you want to be treated. And then if you find enemies or perceive them to be enemies, do everything within your power to make them friends. Boy, that sounds great. When we're in a sanctuary or getting a card from a beloved friend, that sounds really good, but it's not the way it's happening on my main street, and possibly not the way it's happening in your main street. And then we have Martin Luther King Jr. The only way to get rid of an enemy permanently is to make him your friend. Well, again, great idea. But oh my word, how do we do this? How do we think about it? How do we do it? How do we preach about it? The next slide. Thank you, Steve. Is bridging divides a hope? Is it a reality? Is it a mystery? Is it an eschatological vision, something that I hold to my heart and my soul, but expect to see in the afterlife when all things shall be finished? Or am I, as a liberally raised United Church of Canada, let's be nice to everyone, we're really all the same, aren't we? We love our neighbor as ourselves. Everybody is welcome in my church. Is it simple naivete? Thanks, Steve. Yes, the next one. To put it bluntly, Rabbi Shapiro, while diversity is inherent in nature, divides are narratives that one is taught that elevate the other as an existential threat to one's privilege, power, and authority. And the chief source, he says, of othering is religion. Well, that's you and me, isn't it? Because we are practitioners of religion. And so while diversity is a great scientific thing, we know that it happens in so many different ways. Divides are things that we also teach in our formation. Oh boy, we have a problem. We have a series of problems. We have a series of problems. So that's what I wanted to outline for you in terms of the series of problems. And I'm going to tell you a quick story. I was in Collegeville, Minnesota at the Collegeville Institute, which is an ecumenical, actually it's a Benedictine institution, the first illuminated Bible in 500 years since the Reformation is in Collegeville, Minnesota. It was arranged for by the Benedictines. They had a large hand in getting Vatican II off the ground. On their Catholic campus, they developed a small ecumenical institute. There I was, larking on, as I do, or did, about how inclusive our church is and how we work so hard at making everyone welcome, and we have emerging spirit, and we have affirming congregations. And Jason from Texas turned to me and said, tell me about being an affirming congregation. And I use the word lark on advisedly, because that's on reflection what I was doing. And he said to me, Catherine, I am not welcome in your church. And I said, Jason, of course you are. And he said, no, I am not. Because many of the things that your church stands for, I think, are abhorrent. And many things about me, you want to change. So he said, I can't belong in your church. I might be able to come through the door, but I am not truly welcome. Well, that set me back on my heels. Let me tell you, that set me back on my heels. So since 2010, when I met Jason, I've been wondering about this divides thing. And if not everybody can be welcome and really belong in my faith community, what does that do to my faith identity? What does that do to my understanding of Christ? What does that do to the preaching that I do every Sunday, which is largely about the wide universal breadth of the love of God made human, visible, tactile, heartbeat. That's a heart beating, not a fist, in the person of Christ. Here we are with these divides. So let's have a look at, since I think I've kind of outlined where we're coming from a bit with the question at hand, let's listen to John for a few minutes as we dive a bit into scripture, because that is our primary source of wisdom.
So thank you, Catherine. And I'll talk So one of the things Catherine noted in terms of a methodology when we wrote the book, but also as we've done webinars like this with Steve over the last number of years, is that we'll also, there's a passage that Catherine's going to come to later from Luke chapter 12, and she'll talk about what it would be like to preach on that passage. But for any of these themes, there are multiple passages we could choose. And so I want to talk about 5 other ones tonight, besides the one Catherine will illustrate. A few thoughts about those passages and how we might preach on them. And maybe, Steve, after I've done this, we can have a little time for Q&A if people have any questions. So I'm going to take this just in a slightly different order. I actually want to start, I'm going to come to Ephesians, but I want to start with the Tower of Babel. And my own thinking about this for a long time was to think of unity as a good thing and to think about division, scattering, what the folks who built the tower had done, what happened to them as punishment, and certainly as a bad thing. I had occasion to read Walter Brueggemann's commentary, or parts of his commentary, in this case, his comments on this particular passage a while ago. And I'll just say, for people who haven't met or heard me before, Brueggemann is one of my favorite authors, and his commentary on Genesis is one I've gone back to again and again. And I just find my own faith deepened by my wrestling with him. And Brueggemann suggests that rather than that way I've usually thought about Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, that story, we need to think of this a lot more subtly. And what Brueggemann says is unity obviously can be a good thing, but it can be a bad thing. And the scattering, which is a way in which what happens to the people who build the tower, spreading abroad or being scattered is, in this particular passage, punishment, a bad thing, but it's not always a bad thing. And he refers to the chapter before in the book of Genesis, where we see a description after the flood of the various families of the earth, and they're scattered abroad or spread abroad with God's blessing as a means of conveying understanding about God and who God is. And if I think about it, obviously in the church, and I'm going to come to this in other passages later tonight, we think about unity as something we want to achieve. But I'm also aware that unity and a push for unity can be quite oppressive. It can be a way of endeavoring to achieve a kind of cultural oneness. And one has to think only, as we are so aware of what has happened in this, our country, most recently, what's happened in terms of Indigenous folks. There was an effort to create a particular kind of common culture that denied the various cultures of Indigenous peoples in this country. I think in the passage from Genesis 11, unity here is a way of, it's about human self-sufficiency. That's what the people are wanting to do. They're wanting to figure out how to live without God. And I'm reminded of that passage earlier in Genesis chapter 3, where a particular tree was especially attractive because to eat its fruit made you to be like God, knowing good and evil. So there is within us also that desire to, at points, live without God, or at least live following lights different from those we believe, those to which we believe God would call us. So I think that in this passage, that more kind of subtle interpretation that Brueggemann suggests we might want to think about has much to offer, and because yes, at one level, absolutely, we seek unity, but the unity that we seek is a unity to, in fact, create, I would say, an alternative community, one that's powered by an alternative imagination, and that seeks to organize our life and our living to encourage a community that wants to live according to God's purposes and wrestle out what those might be. I'm going to move on and just talk quite quickly about Acts chapter 2. And again, in this case, because Brueggemann in his reflections on Genesis 11 references Acts 2. And if you follow the Revised Common Lectionary, you will know that on Pentecost Sunday, these are two of the suggested lessons. Well, always Acts 2. And one of the things that I must confess I had not noticed until, again, I was reading Brueggemann, is that he points out that in Acts chapter 2, those who hear Peter and the other apostles, he notes that they hear them speaking to them in their own language. And if you run through Acts chapter 2, 1 to 13, but especially in the middle portion to the latter portion of that reading, there's an emphasis on people hearing and hearing in their own language, hearing them speaking. And then later on in the chapter, Peter talks about listening. We think about divides. One of the things that can help to overcome divides is when we really seek to listen. Yes, to speak, but to listen and to hear. And perhaps especially to listen and to hear those whose view is different from our own, those in fact who would disagree with us. So I think here, what attracts in some ways, what stands out, the references to different languages. But I think in our time in thinking about divides, it's useful to pick up this other motif that's very much there in Acts chapter 2 about people who listen and who hear, and who in their listening and their hearing begin to reflect differently on this message. Some of them reject it, yes, but others are moved by it and want to know more. And certainly I think if not to overcome the divide, at least to be able to begin to build a relationship that somehow stretches across it, requires us, in fact, to listen, to hear, and not just to hear and listen superficially, but to listen and to hear deeply. I'll come back now to Ephesians 4, 1 to 6. It's a wonderful little passage about unity in the Spirit, Trinitarian reference here, the effort to, as Paul said, to, with humility and gentleness and patience, bear one another in love. The first 3 chapters of Ephesians is a somewhat more theological reflection on the church. And the last 3 chapters are more about the practicalities of living, of trying to live out that theological understanding. And we have here Paul saying, this is something we need to do, that living with humility, gentleness, patience, that there is a oneness, the possibility of unity within this church, but it requires that kind of an approach. And again, I think, without taking more time right now, there's again in a sermon, an opportunity here to really spend some time thinking about what Paul says. And I'm going to now talk about 1 Corinthians and Galatians, and maybe a more general comment. I think we could, as preachers with prophets, spend a lot more time with Paul. Paul was somewhat out of fashion at one point in time. My New Testament prof, when I was a student, theology student long ago in the United School of Theology, was a Pauline specialist. He was a Jesuit, but also he was a Pauline specialist, and I think gave me an appreciation for Paul. And a book I read came out 30 years ago, hard to believe, by Lauren Mead, The Once and Future Church. Mead doesn't explicitly make this connection as I think he could have, but he talks about how the early church, many of the issues that we now face in an increasingly secularized culture, mirror situations and challenges the early church faced. But I want to say I think that's particularly true of Paul. We can idolize the early church, but you read through Paul's letters and you discover they disagreed with one another about things. They had violent, passionate arguments. And if not the exact problems and challenges we face, what lies behind them, these things that Paul will address, are very common. And so there's this, for me, quite fascinating, I would say wonderful reflection in 1 Corinthians 8 about whether it's okay to eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol. Now, I need to say this is not something that I have spent a lot of time worrying about in its literal sense of the word. But what Paul's getting at is something that with which I certainly have wrestled, and I would argue as Christians we need to wrestle. So what's going on here, of course, is that in Corinth, ancient Corinth, much of the meat that you could buy was in fact meat that had been sacrificed in any one of a number of temples. And some in the early Christian community in Corinth said, well, I know that these gods to whom these have been sacrificed don't exist, so if I want meat, this is a good source to get it, and why is it a problem to eat it? But others were troubled by that, either because they were now Christian, but had worshipped these gods before, still wondered if maybe they existed, and thought certainly these sacrifices were wrong, and therefore it was wrong to do so. And one of the questions that comes to Paul, among a number of other very practical things, is it okay to eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols? And Paul, in his response, makes clear, nothing wrong with this. Doesn't trouble my conscience at all. I'd be quite prepared to do it. But then he goes on to say, unless in my doing it, I create a stumbling block for somebody else. Somebody seeing me do this might think, oh, this is okay, but they still hold that previous affiliation in some way. And Paul said it could lead them astray. And so he concludes by saying, I'm never going to eat or do anything that's going to cause somebody else. I'm never going to knowingly eat something or do something that will cause somebody else to stumble. It's for me a really fine illustration of the challenge of trying to live a loving life. Jacques Ellul, in a book on ethics, remarked that being a Christian, with the freedom of a Christian, doesn't mean being like a butterfly flies from one lovely flower to another. But in fact, it's a really radical call, and it's tough, and it's not easy. And Paul's illustration here is along that line. And similarly, the passage, and this is one that Catherine pointed out to me, from Galatians chapter 5, where Paul speaks again here about the freedom that he starts in verse 13 by talking about the freedom of the Christian, that Christ has set us free. And then he moves on to this commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And elsewhere, Paul says that, this is what sums up this is the law of love, that we fulfill this command when we love our neighbor. But again, loving your neighbor is not always easy. And it's not just in the way we think. Maybe we find our neighbor obnoxious and we just find it hard to imagine the good relationship. And that can be the person in the church who also rubs us the wrong way. The motif through which we approach is love. And that sometimes means disagreeing with somebody. It sometimes means really challenging somebody. A man named Ted Loder wrote a quite wonderful prayer in which he included the line, God, give us the strength to love the enemies we create. Love does not always mean it doesn't mean a kind of easy acquiescence, but it does mean, as much as we can and above all else, genuinely caring for the other, which can mean affirming, it can mean challenging. It does not mean being paternalistic and always knowing what's best, but it means searching for and seeking what's best. Anyway, some thoughts about some other passages of Scripture besides Luke 12 that you could consider if you wanted to try and consider using if you wanted to try to preach around this particular theme. So let me stop there. Over to you, Steve.
So yeah, so this is the time when, and it's really not up to me at all. It's up to you. We want to invite you just to take a moment to pause and think about what we just heard. Think about the ways that divides are an issue in the congregation that you're a part of or in the neighborhood where you live. Think about the kinds of things that Catherine and John have acknowledged. Are they scratching an itch for you? Is this an issue in where you live? Is there something you're wondering about in what they've said? Or are you wondering about some of those passages John put up? Have you got more to say? So we'll take just a moment to see what emerges on the chat. And I'm kind of chattering away here because we don't see anything you write until you push the enter button. And if there aren't comments, that's great. We'll just move on to the next section.
Yep.
If there are, now's a good time to jump in and have some conversation. I was sharing before we turned the recording on, folks, about how this very issue came up in a group that I was leading of my congregation folks at 6 this is the fact of the divisions or the divides around us is troubling to folk. Saw an article in one of the news feeds I read, a column somebody had Canadians are just having far too much fun firing people who aren't vaccinated. I thought was a very interesting comment. Like, you know, if we're just turning them into the enemy without really understanding where they're coming from, we're furthering the divides instead of paying attention to what's breaking us apart. I didn't read the article, but I thought the title was excellent. I'm not seeing stuff come up in the chat, but I don't want to fall. Here we go. Are divides helpful, says Diane, creating identity, what we stand for? Interesting comment. What do you think? You were suggesting, and that kind of goes along with the rabbi's comment to Catherine.
It certainly does. And I recall as a child when we were told what Canadian was, it was not British and not American.
Yes.
That sense of boundary and identity. And I think, Diane, yes, it is helpful in creating identity. And it's partly what we stand for and what we stand against. Jason in Texas and me standing for things that are very different. It's also, we can't be everything. You know, every congregation can't be everything. Every congregation needs to have a sense of a particular mission and focus, or a couple perhaps of those, but not everything, because we can't be everything. And we see this coming up, I think, a little more clearly, just looking briefly at what's there. Yes, the divides between vaccinated and unvaccinated is prominent. It gives us a level of comfort or not. I don't know if Ian and Rosemary and Cecile will all read their comments, or Steve, maybe you'd read them.
Let me just kind of highlight the issues here, because certainly, I mean, Cecile's acknowledging the divide between vaccinated and unvaccinated is prominent, and an anxiety that if we have people coming to church and people staying on Zoom or whatever, that we're creating congregations. What do you think of that? There's a practical element of that as well as everything else, right?
Certainly is.
I have been wondering about the people who have been part of our Zoom services for the last 18 months and the people who haven't, because they don't use computers, and who will not be in the same place as the rest of us have been worshiping every week. There's another divide that's been caused by the pandemic that's not about political beliefs, but it's with technology. You're going to tell us how to bridge these divides, right? I don't have to read you Mary's question. The next section, isn't that right?
Oh, answers. Wouldn't answers be great? Do you want to read the other comments and then we'll move along? Is that?
I'm seeing Rosemary say, how do we bridge divides? If a side is willing to opt into a solution. Mary saying, fear is so much a part of the divides we experience.
Yeah, if I were to make a general comment, I think, and it's along the line that Rosemary has just put up, the degree to which one of the most troubling things for me in the contemporary world, one sees it, I think, especially in the United States, but is certainly far from absent here in Canada, is the degree to which divides are embraced for partisan political reasons. And I don't think we do it in the church, but we certainly do it in the broader society. And it creates, I think it creates huge issues for the ability to genuinely to listen to one another, and to be able to make common cause around things. I mean, and where I'm concerned about that is when you get a highlighting of a particular area of disagreement into division, it can make working together on a number of other things where we agree just much more difficult. So that's that's a more general kind of reflection. It's for me a really worrisome trend that I've seen in my own lifetime. So, and I mean, and if I think more broadly, just I mean, again, if I look at early church, there are lots of deep divisions that are there. But again, I think Paul's counsel, and I'm thinking in my head here, 1 Corinthians 8, what's the loving thing to do? That's a significant kind of leitmotif for Paul, I think, that you see across his writings. And it's not that it's always easy, and it doesn't mean that it's always yes in a particular situation. Sometimes it can be yes and sometimes it can be no, is the more loving thing to do. Paul recognizes individual circumstance, I think, in a way that we probably don't give him enough credit for doing. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble.
No, that's fine. I think we can move on. I can sort of summarize the comments in the chat by saying people are acknowledging that you've hit on an issue, and we're acknowledging different kinds of divides around our identity, divides that create or are created by fear, divides that are political, divides in various different ways, but certainly the general agreement in the chat that this is an issue we need to wrestle with, and people looking forward to the next step. So having made that kind of executive, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. And John, you're going to read the gospel passage.
I shall. So we have here passage where Jesus has been teaching and talking, and he says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one house will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, and mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law."
Thank you. Steve, the next slide shifts us into another concern. We're going to look at where these divides are a concern. Now, I was just over the moon when the New Yorker arrived yesterday, and here's the cover. The cartoon on the cover has a title, and the title is "Crossing the Divide." And you'll notice that there are about 10 or a dozen angry-looking people in this boat. There's a U.S. flag. There's somebody who looks like George Washington. There's a woman very diligently rowing. People are rowing in different directions, and it's called Crossing the Divide. So that could be any number of divides, and that's where we want to go now. Where do we see divides? So we'll have the next two. Thank you, and the next one. We'll stop here for a minute. Where do we see the divides? I want to acknowledge the photography work of Jim Stewart and Paul Preston in our congregation. Some of these slides come from congregational hikes. And so here we are with a crevasse. That's a very threatening thing. A crevasse on a glacier is life-threatening for sure. And these people appear to be moving toward and away from it. So there's a threat here, a strong threat. And divides can be family divisions about power or about money or about long-term hurts or greed or misunderstandings or betrayals. Family divisions can run long and deep and hard and be very threatening and be life-defying. We have divides concerning politics, whether it's party politics in the province where I live, whether it's about the LRT system in the city where I live, whether it's about what's happening in Glasgow currently in people's strong understandings of what we need to be doing for the climate in which we live. Strong divides about pandemic, about public health, about sexuality, about ethnic and racial issues. And these are long-standing things. We have always had divides. In this country, every immigrant group has faced resistance, and that's been long-standing. When I lived in Canmore, there was a lot of resistance to renaming the peak, the definitive peak for that town, after Ha Ling, who was the first one who climbed it. But there was just a resistance to his humanity, and he was instead known by his racial background, and so was the peak on the mountain. And it's happened from the German immigration in the 1750s. It happened in the Irish immigration in the middle of the 19th century. It happens in the immigration that's going on around us. It is part of our history. It's a long-standing theme. We have been here before. Perhaps indeed, as the wisdom writer says, perhaps there is in fact nothing new under the sun. But there are around us the kinds of issues that are so explosive that oftentimes we do everything we can to avoid them. Because if we dare bring them up, we are going to lose a slice of our congregation, which can threaten our very existence financially. If we bring them up in our family, they will damage long-term relationships. And if there is an argument with a family member, it might be that another family member would be hurt by our stepping forward to try to address the divide. So many of these issues are things that are explosive, and so we try to avoid them. We have the next slide for a moment, thank you. Boundary, in consideration of divides, we also need to consider boundaries. We cannot escape boundaries, as we said a few moments ago with the chat. There is an identity factor in boundaries. And the shaping of boundaries can affect and define not only identity, but can also lead to wholeness and health. Or alternately, the shaping of boundaries can lead us to brokenness and that which is actually rancid. But I want to acknowledge, before we go any further, the presence of boundaries and our ability to create healthy boundaries, the necessity for healthy boundaries spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, physically, in terms of civic things, that boundaries and divides are not just a threat like that glacial crevasse, they are also a necessary thing. So divides by itself is not good nor bad. It's not part of a binary in that regard, because we do certainly need divides and boundaries often. And, you know, in that Luke reading, sometimes it is the mother against daughter that is the boundary for protective reasons. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So let's look at the next slide. Thank you. Say perhaps a boundary that brings a sense of beauty and an ability to breathe, an ability to draw a breath, an ability to be a full human being in this wonderful world. So sometimes the boundaries and divides are absolutely essential. So we'll move to the next slide, please. I want to think about politics a bit, because politics is often caught up in the divides that are affecting us at the moment. And the word politics comes from the Greek polis, which means the affairs of the city. So politics has to do with who we are as a civic group. And I certainly have heard a lot in the last 21 months, well, the last 6 years, about a politics of contempt. And the politics of contempt and the theology of contempt are a willingness and a statement that it's almost a spit. It's a put down. The treating one another with contempt is minimizing, diminishing who the other person is. The politics of contempt is not about simply what you are doing or what you think is right or wrong, but it's about you. It's about me, that someone believes that I am contemptible. And that very bitter, salty, bitter kind of politics is something we've read a lot about and experience a great deal. A young friend of mine moved from an apartment that looked over the Legislative Assembly. She was moving actually to university in Boston to do PhD work, and her university apartment here at the University of Alberta had overlooked the Legislative Assembly, and every Saturday she saw people who were who held in contempt the work that she was doing in science. And they were out, and she could hear them from her balcony every morning, every Saturday. So every 7 days, she was aware of a group of people who spoke with contempt, who waved signs, who had no use for her, and who would spit on her if they knew what it was that she did. It's just a terrible thing to be living with every 7 days. And so we want to think about a politics of compassion. Compassion, which is living with, right? Compassion being with. And what does the gospel of Jesus Christ, what does Luke say about the responsibility that I have in the community? And there are a couple of things that are, well, you have to be, I think, really, really brave. I think it's radical and brave. And the first thing is the naming, the honest naming of the issues that divide us. Identifying the points of fissure, claiming any common ground that we can find, but naming that which is different. And it may well be that we can only bridge that divide. And those who work on this say that, in fact, we can only bridge the divide by, in fact, being together. Not in this virtual setting, but actually in a room where we breathe the same air, where we're aware of the body language, where we see the rolling eyes, where we see the shifting, the discomfort, but where we also see the lean in, the possibility. Highly structured, it needs to be highly structured to really be able to reach metaphorically across to the other side. It is a radical call. I think it takes a huge amount of courage for the things that really, really matter to us. And so if you bring the next slide up, thanks, Steve. In southern Alberta, when you are driving across the very flat territory, all of a sudden the road will literally fall in front of the nose of your car. It's called a coulee. C-O-U-L-E-E. It comes from a French word which means to flow, couler. But driving across it's just a phenomenal experience. It's terrifying when you're not accustomed to it. It's one of those things that takes you out of who you are. It's exciting and exhilarating, but you drive across the flat of the prairie, the flat of the parkland, and then all of a sudden the road tips and here you are. But sometimes, hey presto, when you get down into the divide, you discover that there are these wonders of the world that you didn't know were there before. One of the wonders of the world that I am just completely always gobsmacked about is the KT line, which you can see in Drumheller, and it's the literal orange line that crosses between two geological times of the life of the world after the Cretaceous. So when 75% of the species of the earth was wiped out, there's this orange line, the KT line, right in the rock. It's just outstanding. It takes me out of myself. It's quite remarkable. So what I want to say about this kind of divide is that sometimes we come along to it, we're exhilarated, we're excited, we're terrified. We take the dip into the divide and we discover things that are beautiful and amazing and that open us up to possibility and that change the way we see the world. And I want to offer at this point in changing the way we see the world that Dr. King said the only way to get rid of an enemy permanently is to make him your friend. Impossible. But driving into the divide is also an impossible concept. But sometimes we find the treasure. Sometimes we find the treasure. But if you're anything like me, you need an awful lot of encouragement. And it's one thing for Jesus to get up and say that there's going to be father against son and mother against daughter, that this is the way it's going to be. But I also want some contemporary words about that. So this next slide, give me encouragement. Adam Grant, the psychologist, the absence of conflict isn't harmony, it's apathy. Well, I would like to have no conflict, but I don't want to be apathetic. So I get some energy from that. Dana Roberts, who teaches at the Boston University School of Theology, this one, I am going to put on a poster. If we cannot have true friendship across boundaries, Jesus is a liar. Holy cats! If we cannot have true friendship across boundaries, Jesus is a liar. I'm going to put this up on walls all over the place. Eugene Peterson speaks and writes about a long obedience in the same direction. That gives me some energy for the long term. But my real challenge is, am I brave enough for a politics of compassion? Am I brave enough for a politics of compassion? Well, maybe I'll get some strength from these solidly considered words. Maybe I'll get some strength from Jesus the Christ. If we move on to the next slide, this is where I'm going to get a lot of strength. It's because I'm not in it alone. Because you're there and you've got a rope. And if I go near the edge of that crevasse, you are going to pull me out if I'm in trouble, right? We are in this together. It's so important. So I'm going to tell you a story. You know, in working through all of this about, whether or not Jesus would be a liar, I thought, I have to do this. I have to ask. And so I've been avoiding this for weeks. Someone I know well in the community who would like to walk the labyrinth in my church. And she's been asking for 21 months, can I come and walk the labyrinth? And I finally wrote to her and said, yes, you can come in now. We're allowing people in the church a few at a time. You just have to register and simply send us your proof of vaccination. Well, she said, Catherine, dear, there'll be another time. And I thought, oh no, you've got to be kidding. So I let that go, I have to tell you, for a number of weeks. But because I needed to be honest with you as I was doing this particular presentation, I sent her a letter and I said, look, will you have a conversation with me? You know that I respect you. You know that I love you. And I know that you love me because you told me that. Now, we're not close friends and she's not part of my congregation, but there we are. I said, I'd like to have a conversation. I will bring no judgment. I will not try to persuade you. I will listen. And she said, I am flattered. Can you imagine that? She was flattered that I would reach out across what she knew was a huge crevasse, a huge divide, and say that I would listen. And so I did. And I thought, she's a lovely person. We've had great times over the years. We've done many things together. It's going to be all right. It was dead awful, not all right. It was dead awful, not all right. It was everything a person might fear, a person in my position, because of the language, the perspective. I did it. I listened. I did not judge. I respect her. I just, I think so highly of her. It certainly ran through my mind, how could she be so misguided? I did not say that out loud. I restrained myself. I did not say that out loud, because I had said that I would not do any of those kinds of things. So we did not argue, but she knows that I am leading a congregation in which, in order to come into the building, a person must show proof of vaccination or a recent COVID test if they're unable to be vaccinated for whatever good health reason. So she knows where I am on this divide. And I knew where she was on the divide. And my heart pounded through that conversation. It was really, really, really difficult. So we're going to go on because I want to come back to this person in a second, because the next thing is, how is this going to preach? And the next slide is really my question. What is my purpose in preaching about divides? What is my purpose? If my purpose is to reassure everybody who's in the church that they've done the right thing, and here's the love my neighbor iteration that the United Church has been offering out all about why we do this, that would be one thing. But I'm preaching to the choir, right? So we're all going to feel good about one another, but is that a deeply meaningful sermon? Well, it's comfort, but it's not dangerous enough. It's not brave enough. It's not a politics of compassion. It's a politics of protection. So I'm not going to do that. So what is the purpose of the sermon that I'm going to preach? What is the purpose? So I'm going to give you a title on this next slide. My title is going to be Holy Fools Tripping Over Ourselves, or I might change it to Holy Fools Tripping Over My Own Feet and make it even more personal, not about us, but about me. Holy fool tripping over my own feet. This might be what I do. Because if the purpose of my sermon is to convince people and make public health a better thing, my sermon is going to fail, because I am not going to convince this person I've just been speaking to. She's going to watch it on Zoom or she's going to see it on the video. I am not going to convince her. It will fail. So if the purpose of my sermon is to change people's minds, it's not going to work. If the purpose of my sermon is for the sake of relationship, which is the essence of who we are as a Trinitarian people, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, the Holy One in constant relationship, constant dance, constant relationship. If this, as the fundamental of what I believe is the Christian faith, is the purpose of my sermon, then I think it could succeed. I think I could prepare a good sermon. But I want to say this. I want to say this as the person preparing the sermon that has to do with relationship and that fundamental of the human Christian faith, even though mother against daughter, even though father against son, that the sake of relationship is the thing that I'm getting at. I also want to say that it does seem insufficient, because what I want to do is I want to change the world. I want to change the world. I want to heal this divide, get us all vaccinated, and then we're going to be trooping right in and out of buildings and doing all, but I can't, right? I can't change the world. So what I want to do, I can't do. So the question is going to stick with me. Is this sermon going to be satisfying or not? Religions are supposed to emphasize peace and unity. So what I'm hoping for is that in the sermon that I write, maybe my humility will inspire somebody else's prophecy. Maybe my ability to be the holy fool tripping over myself will inspire someone else to be prophetic. And it's not that I'm trying to be mealy-mouthed or get away with anything, but maybe by not being prideful and full of hubris, and I know what's right on my side of the divide, maybe I can open up something where there will be some kind of a bridge, or maybe there'll be some kind of compassion. Maybe the ethic of light, of love will happen. So let's move to the next slide. What I want to do in this, first of all, is I'm going to acknowledge I'm not an idiot. You're an idiot, except it's because you hear that, right? That how could those idiots? And I hear it from both sides. I heard it from my friend, and I hear it from my friends. Those idiots on the other side. So to indicate, that maybe I'm the idiot. There are people who think I'm an idiot. Will that humility inspire someone else's prophecy. And here's where I'm going to set myself up to trip all over my values, to trip all over my feet, to trip right into the divide. And that is to proclaim that Jesus is the crisis of the world. Now, John's gospel does that all over the place. Jesus is the crisis of the world. As a Christian, Jesus is the crisis of the world because everything is bouleversé. Everything is turned upside down, right? Jesus is the crisis of the world does not mean that Jesus is the crisis for Muslims or for anybody else. That is not where I'm going. You know me well enough to know that that's the case. But to think about Jesus as the crisis of the world, this concept that we are divided, mother against daughter, and Jesus is the crisis of the world. Okay, now we're moving into scripture in a way that is only moderately terrifying. So I want to say a couple of things about where this comes from. This particular passage that John read about, do I come to bring peace or a sword? That's also found in Matthew. And it's set up just a little bit differently in Matthew. So it's worth playing around with what it means in Matthew and what it means in Luke. I wanted to use the Lucan one because Jesus speaks the word divisions. So one thing is Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. There is no time like the present. Let's get on it. Cut to the chase. Cut to the chase. There are divides. The other thing is the reality of the world in which Luke and Matthew were writing, and that is that families were divided. In this iteration from Jesus, there is a description of what was happening, which was because of the way of Jesus, people were divided, families were divided. It was a governing consideration. Absolutely essential. So it's important to note, so let's move to the next slide, that, let's go back, sorry, my mistake. Crisis does not mean an emergency, but crisis, Jesus is the crisis of the world. Crisis is about that moment, that occasion when we say, aha, there has to be a truth, there has to be some, I am acknowledging something that's going on here. So the crisis is the occasion of recognizing the division, not the emergency about it, but simply acknowledging the division. So I am going to acknowledge the division. I'm going to acknowledge the divide between me and the ones that I would call other, because otherwise I kind of have to stick my face into the sand. So it's the calling of Jesus, this crisis, this occasion to see the division, to speak about it, to talk about it, to preach about it. And there's something even just in acknowledging this sermon is going to happen on divides that people go, oh, thank God, she's talking about something that matters. Even if I don't get it right, I'm talking about something that matters, right? And what is important about church unless it's about things that matter? And frankly, we don't have to all get it right all at the same time. I'm not getting it right every time. I might get it right once in a while, and that's a good thing. But we're talking about what matters. And that's where it's the relationship. That's where it's the relationship. It's church saying the theme this Sunday is divides, and people going, well, thank God I can go to this one. I might be scared. Who knows what's going to happen? But it matters. It matters. It matters. And so I acknowledge the division. I have to acknowledge what we've said earlier about divides being abhorrent, and that it's there. That's where we are. I want to say that, well, let's move on to the next slide. Thanks very much. Yep. So in terms of the preaching event, most of us have been out of the building for a long time. I have to tell you, I haven't preached a 20-minute sermon in 21 months. And bless her heart, the chair of our worship committee with whom I spent yesterday morning said, yes, Catherine, and you know what? None of us have listened to a 20-minute sermon for 21 months either. You may be out of practice, but so are we. So I'm going to have to make this sermon vivid. I'm going to have to, and so this idea of the tripping image is great. And it begins with humility. And humility comes from the Greek humilis, which means low or grounded. And the word human comes from humus, which means from the earth. And so we've got that same thing there. We've got humility and being human. And so we can do this. We can trip over over the earth. You can play with that image of tripping over thresholds if you want, tripping over divides, tripping into a crevasse and having your hiking friends haul you out by the roof. You could play with the tripping image and the humility that we bring into these conversations where there are divides. It's really important to acknowledge that in asking someone, why do you feel that way? It's not a compromise or an endorsement. When I spoke with my friend, she knew I was not endorsing what she said. She knew I really didn't believe her, but I was trying to understand, not so that I could buy in. So I'm not giving up my ground, okay? I'm not giving up my ground in having this conversation and in setting up a sermon, the purpose of which is going to be to help people deal with the divides in their own lives, in their neighborhoods, in their families, in all those kinds of things. So let's move to the next slide. Oh, wow. I'm going to show you a book in a few minutes that you're going to want to buy before midnight. And it's where I read this. Annie Leonard, Annie Leonard is an environmentalist. She's an environmental genius. And when she talks about environmentalists, she says there is no way. When you throw something away, it has to go somewhere, right? When you throw something away, it goes somewhere. And if in our divides, we simply put people away, if we identify them as other, if we stop the conversations, if we shut down the relationship, it's like we're throwing them away, but there is no away. Eventually, we're going to have to deal with them. You can take a break overnight, you can take a break for the week, you can take a break till you think the pandemic is over, but eventually you're going to have to deal with one another, eventually. And Dr. King said, the only way to get rid of an enemy permanently is to make him your friend. That's the way he said it. So to have conversations together, to prepare the people who are listening to our sermons, to have conversations with family members, with neighbors, with friends, without the other one thinking that they think they're an imbecile. I'm not an idiot, you're an idiot. Without thinking that you're imbecilic, this is just a huge challenge because the divides are so embedded. So people have their ankles in the ground and they're pushing back hard. When I finished this conversation with the friend, she sent me all kinds of stuff, which is just, there's just huge amounts of material out there on the other side of the divide. Not that I didn't know it was there. I was ignoring it. I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to read it. I thought it was imbecilic. Now it's in my inbox. And with some respect, I will read some of it, but I certainly will not read all of it. So what I'm suggesting we're doing in this sermon is that we are forming community by practice. And practice isn't perfect, right? The reason I keep practicing my piano lesson is because I never actually get the Bach right. I never get the Chopin right. I never get the piece right. So I keep practicing. So we have to allow ourselves to make mistakes in all of this. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Together is better. So we're not in this alone. We are in this with people who have been dealing with divides, division, hostility, death, warfare, deep barriers for a very, very long time. Corrymeela is the oldest peace and reconciliation community on the island of Ireland. Some of you have probably been there. During the Troubles that rocked Northern Ireland in the latter part of the 20th century, it served as a refuge for people who were fleeing violence. And today it offers shelter for people who are trying to get at projects or difficult conversations. People come into the same room and they have a cup of tea and they argue and they talk and they stumble through the rocky terrain of telling the truth. They stumble through the rocky terrain of telling the truth. The next slide is a picture of Corrymeela, where together is better. And I'm going to tell you a little story about it. Hadrigo Tuama, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name really well, but he was there for many, many years. And he says that some time ago, people named this particular land that you can see, that's the main house, Corrymeela, and they thought it meant Hill of Harmony. Isn't that great? Hill of Harmony. If you're going to have a place where you can talk about difference and violence and father against son and mother against daughter, to go to a place called the Hill of Harmony is a wonderful place for reconciliation. But somebody showed up many, many years later who knew something about Old Irish and said, actually, no, Corrymeela, the word Corrymeela does not mean Hill of Harmony. Corrymeela means place of lumpy crossings. Isn't that great? Place of lumpy crossings. So I think the idea of doing a sermon where I talk about tripping over things and I end up thinking about Corrymeela and the people who for these generations have been dealing with the divides, and they are working in a place called place of lumpy crossings, is a very visual, a very visceral, a very physical image. And I think it would work. I think it would work as a sermon. Now, I have to tell you, I'm going to try it on Sunday, and I might come back to you next week and just, and we may end up with, 3 views or dead end views or something. But I'm going to try it this week, this place of lumpy crossings, this tripping over my feet. But my strong hope is that the humility in that speaks to a politics of compassion, which is about an underlying fundamental theological understanding that relationship is what God is about, and that somehow is not going to bridge the divides, but it's going to make me be able to look across that lumpy crossing and at least blow a kiss to my enemy on the other side, because somehow in my humility, in my politics of compassion, in the theology of the Trinity, I am going to be able to love my enemy despite the divides. So I'm going to stop there. There are some wrap-up comments in a few minutes with resources, but I'm going to stop there for the moment.
Oh, so much to think about there. Thank you so much. So again, folks, it's your turn again. And again, I'd invite you to open the chat if you had closed it, and just, again, add your comments, add your thoughts, add your reactions. Does this preach? Is this going to work? Is it enough? Is it useful? Is it ducking the issue? Where are you at with this? And what do you think about what Catherine has been telling us? I love the distinction between politics of contempt and the politics of compassion. I think our desire for wedge issues pushes us into contempt in destructive ways. What time is your sermon, says Elaine?
Thanks. You know what? It's on our YouTube channel. Oh, Ian, you lived there.
In Belfast, Ian says, there were 2 companies just a few hundred yards from each other. Their employment policy was by religion. One company employed Catholic persons, one company employed Protestant persons, and neither the twain shall meet. So there's an important question from Margaret. What if the other person is not open to the conversation?
I think that's a really, really good question, because then we won't be able to have the conversation. For that matter, there may be people who are dead with whom we can't have the conversation. There may be people of whom we are too frightened to have the conversation ourselves. But yes, if the other person is not open, it does leave us in that risky place where we lost a lot of ground as a church because we kind of left ourselves open. So we lost a lot of social justice ground because we didn't speak up and we didn't engage. It is a real risk that the other person is not open. Mm-hmm. And we can get trampled over. And, you know, you think of science fiction movies and it's just, they're rife with groups who are doing the right thing and then get mowed down, right? It is a distinct risk.
Well, yeah, and it occurs to me that you're talking about politics and social divides. Yeah. My divorce felt like that. Now, there's a family divide.
Right.
And I have wrestled with that for 20 years, whether there was something different I could have done to encourage a conversation that seemed then and still seems to me impossible. I don't think we're just talking politics here.
Thank you, Steve, because you're absolutely right. And it's so easy to go to the politics in what I'm preparing because it's so pervasive. But you're absolutely right. It's in the very personal relationships as well and has been for a long, long time.
Brilliant says, talking and listening is great, but in the end, they're still not allowed in your church.
That's right. That's
and you would say
right.
that about your friend Jason too. He still would not feel welcome, even if there would be no physical barrier. He could never feel like he belonged in your church.
That's right. And, you know, after Jason and I had this conversation, I was setting up a blog. I'd never done that before. And he worked with me, showed me how to buy the space, set it up, import pictures. He was supporting my ministry and myself as a person, despite the fact that that he knew that. And the friend in food services about whom I was speaking knows that she won't be coming in our church. And yet we are figuring out how to be, we are friendly. We are still friendly. She's sending me the information, not because she's going to persuade me either, she knows better, but because I asked. And yeah, I'm baffled. And I do think very highly of her. So she was a good person to talk to about it because I didn't want, you know, I wasn't ready to minimize her, which I could be with somebody from whom I had more judgment, which is not a beautiful thing to say, but it's true.
It's so easy to jump to the idea that the other person is an idiot. A couple of people on the chat talking about lumpy crossings and just appreciating the image, Catherine. Thank you. Yeah. Rosemary talking about the image of clay on the eyes of the blind person. Oh,
yes.
A lumpy crossing.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not back in the building yet. I will be videoing, and I've been doing a lot of that outdoors. And so I'm going to find some, well, I mean, there's lots of great images there from the congregation about the crevasse, but, you know, it's not hard near the North Saskatchewan River to find lumpy spots where I'll be able to bring a good visual of that into the video. I do have some resources that I want to give you because they have changed my perspective on things. And thanks, Ian. So I do want to not miss those.
Sure. Well, we've got maybe one more minute if there's somebody else who has an extra, one more comment that you'd like Catherine or John to respond to. And then I think you're right, we should go on. We've got about minutes left in our time, and I think the resources are important, Catherine.
Well, and Ian's right. We're on about, you know, generations. We can't solve any of this in 20 minutes. But in setting it up in a sermon, it's a beginning of a practice. I'm practicing what to say. Others are then practicing what to say. Together, we're practicing how to act. It's going to be a long, what's the Eugene Peterson line again? Sorry, it'll just take me a sec to find it. A long obedience in the same direction. It's going to be a long obedience in the same direction. And that's going to be really tiring. But
thinking about one of the standard books for teaching labor union negotiations is called Getting to Yes.
Right, yeah.
Their practice is to look beyond positional arguments to interests. What is the interest being served? Where could we find some common interest, even if we're taking a totally different position? It's a fascinating, I mean, I have used it to think about schooling. But I wonder whether it has some hooks into this too, Catherine.
I think you're absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's time to move along. Maybe next week you can give us a link to the sermon, Catherine. You've excited people about this. My sense of the chat is that people are absorbing. It's not that they're not reacting, but you're talking about things that matter, and there are no easy answers, and that's important. So do that and share the resources. Shall I put out the slide for you?
The first slide, yes, I'll speak to each one briefly. This is from Corey Mila. Padraig Otumeg has, he was the former leader, but spiritualityofconflict.com, isn't that outstanding? And so I recommend that website. There is a book coming out between Padraig and Pat Bennett, whom I've come to know, and it's coming out the end of this month. So I'll bring you a link for that next week, but spiritualityofconflict.com, this is just absolutely outstanding. If we go to the next, of course, absolutely. You know what she does in Divides? Just get a book study. Don't preach a sermon, just do a book study. It's great. The next one, this one really blew my mind. This is the one you have to order by midnight. Michael Waters, for down there, is a friend of mine. And when he said it was coming out, I said, okay. He's an African-American heritage pastor in Dallas, which is one of the most racially charged cities in the US. So this book is full of, it's about 32 short chapters, 33 short chapters by some of these people: Brian McLaren, Diana Butler Bass, Frank Thomas, Shane Claiborne, Parker Palmer. It is absolutely outstanding. There's ideas in here of all kinds of things that, that you can do. And some of what I have been offering to you this evening comes from the wisdom. You'll notice Brian McLaren already, I referred to him early on. This next book is also new, and many of us in the church have been doing work with Betty Priest on conflict and governance and those kinds of things. So just letting you know that's out there and ready to go. One more image, and that is, thank you very much, Paul Preston, and to the people of St. Paul's who make this time available and support it, and who will be seeing some of their camera work in the next little while. So the next slide is the last one for the evening. And there we are. Thank you and good night.
Oh, I'm exhausted just listening to you. What a rich and deep evening, and thank you. Thank you to both of you for the resources, for the thinking, for leaving us with all these loose ends that aren't tied up in a bow, because that's honest and real, and it matters. Thank you for the passion and the excitement and the clarity. It was luminous, and the comments in the chat here, much to ponder. Thank you so much. Thoughtful discussion, wonderful presentation, fabulous, inspiring, challenging. Yeah, they're saying it as well as I can. Tell us about next week. We're gathering again next Tuesday at the same time. What are we doing next week, and how does it tie into?
So we're wanting to talk next week about forgiveness, something about which Scripture and our tradition has a lot to say, and our culture has a lot to say. As let's say phrase "forgive and forget," and yet it's not only challenging to do; it's just something we should try to do. And what do we make of that line in the Lord's Prayer? Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. It's like, what do you do with that? What if there's something I can't forgive? What do I make of that in my tradition? So we want to talk about some of those things next week. So we'll come back, much the same format as tonight. Why is this important? What are some passages you could look at? And then we'll take one of them and go with it. So, and we'll, to a large degree, reverse roles next week. But that's what we want to look at.